contenting themselves by raising their heads, tightening their lips, and generally looking important. At lunchtime, Daisy Hempstock brought a small pot of shepherd's pie for them both, and Bridget Comfrey brought them a mug of spiced ale. And at twilight, another two able-bodied young men of the village arrived to relieve them, carrying a lantern each, and Tommy and Dunstan walked down to the inn, where Mr. Bromios gave each of them a mug of his best ale. And his best ale was very fine indeed. As their reward for doing guard duty, there was a buzz of excitement in the inn. Now, crowded beyond believing, it was filled with visitors to the village from every nation in the world. Or so it seemed to Dunstan, who had no sense of distance beyond the woods that surrounded the village of Wall. So he regarded the tall gentleman in the black top hat at the table beside him, all the way up from London, with as much awe as he regarded the taller ebony-colored gentleman in the white one-piece robe with whom he was dining. Dunstan knew that it was rude to stare, and that as a villager of Wall he had every right to feel superior to all the foreigners. But he could smell unfamiliar spices on the air, and hear men and women speaking to each other in 100 tongues, and he gawked and gazed unashamedly. The man in the silk top hat noticed that Dunstan was staring at him, and he motioned the lad over to him. "Do you like treacle pudding?" he asked abruptly, by way of introduction. "Munton Abbey was called away, and there's more pudding here than a man can manage on his own." Dunstan nodded. The treacle pudding was steaming invitingly on its plate. "Well then," he said to his new friend, "help yourself." He passed Dunstan a clean china bowl and a spoon. Dunstan needed no further encouragement, and he began to demolish the pudding. "Now, young'un," said the gentleman in the black silk top hat to Dunstan once their bowls and the pudding plate were quite empty. "It seems the inn has no more rooms. Also, every room in the village has already been let." "Is that so?" said Dunstan, unsurprised. "That it is," said the gentleman in the top hat. "And what I was wondering was, would you know of a house that might have a room?" Dunstan shrugged. "All the rooms have gone by now," he said. "I remember that when I was a boy of 9, my mother and father sent me to sleep out in the rafters by the cowbriar for a week, and let my room to a lady from the Orient and her family and servants. She left me a kite as a thank you, and I flew it from the meadow until one day it snapped its string and flew away in the sky." "Where do you live now?" asked the gentleman in the top hat. "I have a cottage on the end of my father's land," Dunstan replied. "It was our shepherd's cottage until he died 2 years ago, last Lammastide, and my parents gave it to me." "Take me to it," said the gentleman in the hat, and it did not occur to Dunstan to refuse him. The spring moon was high and bright, and the night was clear. They walked down from the village to the forest beneath it, and they walked the whole way past the Thorne family farm, where the gentleman in the top hat was startled by a cow sleeping in the meadow, which snorted as it dreamt, until they reached Dunstan's cottage. It had one room and a fireplace. The stranger nodded. "I like this well enough," he said. "Come, Dunstan Thorne, I'll rent it from you for the next 3 days." What'll you give me for it? A golden sovereign, a silver sixpence, a copper penny, and a fresh, shiny farthing, said the man. Now, a golden sovereign for 2 nights was more than a fair rent in the days when a farm worker might hope to make £15 in a good year. Still, Dunstan hesitated. If you're here for the market, he told the tall man, then it's a miracle and wonders you'll be trading. The tall man nodded. So it would be miracles and wonder that you would be after, is it? He looked around Dunstan's one-room cottage again. It began to rain then, a gentle pattering on the thatch above. Oh, very well, said the tall gentleman, a trifle testily. A miracle, a wonder. Tomorrow you shall attain your heart's desire. Now, here is your money. And he took it from Dunstan's ear with one easy gesture. Dunstan touched it to the iron nail on the cottage door, checking for fairy gold, and he bowed low to the gentleman and walked off into the rain. He tied the money up in his handkerchief. Dunstan walked to the cow-briar in the pelting rain. He climbed into the hayloft and was soon asleep. He was aware in the night of thunder and of lightning, although he did not wake. And then, in the small hours of the morning, he was woken by someone treading awkwardly on his feet. "Sorry," said a voice. "That is to say, excuse me." "Who's that? Who's there?" said Dunstan. "Just me. I'm here for the market. I was sleeping in the hollow tree for the night, but the lightning toppled it. Cracked it like an egg, it did, and smashed it like a twig, and the rain got down on my neck, and it threatened to get into my baggage, and there's things that still might be kept dry as dust, and I'd keep it safe as houses on all my travellings here, though it was wet as water, suggested Dunstan. Ever so, continued the voice in the darkness. I was wondering, it continued, if you'd mind me staying here under your roof, as I'm not very big, and I'd not disturb you or nothing. Just don't tread on me, sighed Dunstan. It was then that there was a flash of lightning, illuminated the briar, and the light. Dunstan saw something small and hairy in the corner, wearing a large floppy hat, and then darkness. I hope I'm not disturbing you, said the voice, which certainly sounded rather hairy now. Dunstan thought about it. You aren't, said Dunstan, who was very tired. That's good, said the hairy voice, because I wouldn't want to disturb you. Please, begged Dunstan, let me sleep. Please. There was a snuffling noise, which was replaced by gentle snoring. Dunstan rolled over in the hay. The person, whoever it was, farted, scratched itself, and began to snore once more. Dunstan listened to the rain on the briar roof and thought about Daisy Hempstock. And in his thoughts they were walking together. 6 steps behind them walked a tall man with a top hat and a small furry creature whose face Dunstan could not see. They were off to see his heart's desire. There was bright sunlight on his face, and the cow-briar was empty. He washed his face and walked up to the farmhouse. He put on his very best jacket, and his very best shirt, and his very best breeches. He scraped the mud from his boots with a pocket knife, and then he walked into the farm kitchen and kissed his mother on the cheek, and helped himself to a cottage loaf and a large pat of fresh churned butter. And then, with his money tied up in his fine Sunday cambric handkerchief, he walked up to the village wall and bade good morning to the guards on the gate. Through the gap in the wall he could see colored tents being raised, stalls being erected, colored flags, and people walking back and forth. "We're not to let anyone through until midday," said the guard. Dunstan shrugged and went to the pub, where he pondered what he would buy with his savings, the shiny half-crown he'd saved, and the lucky sixpence, with a hole drilled through it, on a leather thong around his neck, and with the additional pocket handkerchief filled with coins. He had, for the moment, quite forgotten there had been anything else promised the night before. At the stroke of midday, Dunstan strode up to the wall, and nervously, as if he were breaking the greatest of taboos, he walked through, beside, as he realized, the gentleman in the black silk top hat, who nodded to him. "Ah, my landlord, and how are you today, sir?" "Very well," said Dunstan. "Walk with me," said the tall man. "Let us walk together." They walked across the meadow toward the tents. "Have you been here before?" asked the tall man. "I went to the last market 9 years ago. I was only a boy," admitted Dunstan. "Well," said his tenant, "remember to be polite and take no gifts. Remember that you're a guest. And now I shall give you the last part of the rent that I owe you, for I swore an oath, and my gifts last a long time, and you and your firstborn child and his or her firstborn child, it's a gift that will last as long as I live." "And what would that be, sir?" "Your heart's desire. Remember," said the gentleman in the top hat. "Your heart's desire." Dunstan bowed and walked on toward the fair. "Eyes, eyes, new eyes for old," shouted a tiny woman in front of a table covered with bottles and jars filled with eyes of every kind and color. "Instruments of music for 100 lands. Penny whistles, tuppenny hums, threepenny choral anthems. Try your luck. Step right up, answer a simple riddle, and win a windflower. Everlasting lavender, bluebell cloth, bottled dreams, a shilling a bottle, coats of night, coats of twilight, coats of dusk, swords of fortune, wands of power, rings of eternity, cards of grace. Roll up, step this way, salves and ointments, philtres and nostrums." Dunstan paused in front of a stall covered with tiny crystal ornaments. He examined the miniature animals, pondering getting one for Daisy Hempstock. He picked up a crystal cat no bigger than his thumb. Sagely, it blinked at him, and he dropped it, shocked. It righted itself in mid-air like a real cat, fell on its 4 paws. Then it stalked over to the corner of the stall and began to wash itself. Dunstan walked on, though the thronged market. It was bustling with people. All the strangers who had come to Wall in previous weeks were there, and many of the inhabitants of the town of Wall as well. Mr. Bromios had set up a wine tent and was selling wines and pastries to the village folk, who were tempted by the food sold by the folk beyond the Wall, but had been told by their grandparents, who had gotten it from their grandparents, it was deeply, utterly wrong to eat fairy food, to eat fairy fruit, to drink fairy water, and to sip fairy wine. For every 9 years the folk from beyond the Wall and over the hill set up their stalls, and for a day and a night the meadow played host to the fairy market. And there was, for one day and one night in 9 years, commerce between the nations. There were wonders for sale, and marvels and miracles. There were things undreamed of and objects unimagined. What need, Dunstan wondered, could someone have of the storm-filled eggshells? He jingled his money in his pocket handkerchief and looked for something small and inexpensive with which to amuse Daisy. He heard a gentle chiming in the air, above the hubbub of the market, and this he walked toward. He passed a stall in which 5 huge men were dancing to the music, lugubrious hurdy-gurdy being played by a mournful-looking black bear. He passed a stall where a balding man in a brightly colored kimono was smashing china plates and tossing them into a burning bowl for which colored smoke was pouring, all while calling out to the passers-by. The chinkling chiming grew louder. Reaching the stall from which the sound was emanating, he saw that it was deserted. It was festooned with flowers, bluebells and foxgloves and harebells and daffodils, but also with violets and lilies, with tiny crimson dog roses, pale snowdrops, blue forget-me-nots, a profusion of other flowers Dunstan could not name. Each flower was made of glass or crystal, spun or carved, he could not tell. They counterfeited life perfectly, and they chimed and jingled like distant glass bells. "Hello," called Dunstan. "Good morrow to you on this market day," said the stall-holder, clambering down from the painted caravan parked behind the stall, and she smiled widely at him, with white teeth and a dusky face. She was one of the folk from beyond the wall. He could tell at once from her eyes and her ears, which were visible beneath her dark curly black hair. Her eyes were a deep violet, while her ears were the ears of a cat, perhaps, gently curved and dusted with a fine dark fur. She was quite beautiful. Dunstan picked up a flower from the stall. "It's very lovely," he said. It was a violet, and it clinked and sang as he held it, making a noise similar to that produced by wetting a finger and rubbing it gently around a wine glass. "How much is it?" She shrugged, with a delightful shrug. "The cost is never discussed at the outset," she told him. "It might be a great deal more than you are prepared to pay. And then you would leave, and we would both be poorer for it. Let us discuss the merchandise in a more general way." Dunstan paused. It was then that the gentleman with the black silk top hat passed by the stall. "There," murmured Dunstan's lodger, "my debt to you is settled, and my rent is paid in full." Dunstan shook his head as if to clear it from a dream, and turned back to the young lady. "So where do these flowers come from?" he asked. She smiled knowingly. "On the side of Mount Calomon, a grove of glass flowers grow. The journey there is perilous, and the journey back is more so." "And of what purpose are they?" asked Dunstan. "The use and function of these flowers is chiefly decorative and recreational. They bring pleasure. They can be given to a loved one as a token of admiration and affection. And the sound they make is pleasing to the ear. Also, they catch the light most delightfully." She held a bluebell up to the light, and Dunstan could not but observe that the color of sunlight glittering through the purple crystal was inferior in both hue and shade to that of her eyes. "I see," said Dunstan. "They are also used in certain spells and cantrips. If Sir is a magician." Dunstan shook his head. There was, he noticed, something remarkable about the young lady. "Ah, even so, they are delightful things," she said, and smiled again. The remarkable thing was a thin silver chain that ran from the young lady's wrist down to her ankle and into the painted caravan behind her. Dunstan remarked upon it. The chain. It binds me to the stall. I am the personal slave of the witch woman who owns the stall. She caught me many years ago as I played by the waterfalls in my father's land, high in the mountains, luring me on and on in the form of a pretty frog, always but for a moment out of my reach, until I had left my father's lands unwittingly, whereupon she resumed her true shape and popped me into a sack. And you are her slave forever? Not forever. And at that the fairy girl smiled. I gain my freedom on the day the moon loses her daughter. If that occurs in a week, when 2 Mondays come together, I await it with patience. And in the meantime, I do as I am bid, and also I dream. Will you buy a flower from me now, young master? My name is Dunstan. And an oddest name it is, too, she said with a teasing grin. Where are your pincers, Master Dunstan? Will you catch the devil by the nose? And what is your name? Asked Dunstan, blushing a deep red. I no longer have a name. I am a slave, and the name I had was taken from me, and I answered to hey, you, or to girl, or to foolish slattern, or to many other imprecations. Dunstan noticed how the silken fabric of her robe pressed itself against her body. He was aware of elegant curves and of her violet eyes upon him, and he swallowed. Dunstan put his hand in his pocket and pulled out his handkerchief. He could no longer look at the woman. He tumbled out his money onto the counter. Take enough for this, picking a pure white snowdrop from the table. We do not take money at this stall. She pushed the coins back toward him. No? What will you take? For by now he was quite agitated, and his only mission was to obtain a flower for Daisy Hempstock, to obtain his flower and to depart. For truth to tell, the young lady was making him exceedingly uncomfortable. I could take the color of your hair, she said, or all your memories before you were 3. I could take the hearing from your left ear. Not all of it, just enough that you'd not enjoy music or appreciate the running of a river or soughing of the wind. Dunstan shook his head. Or a kiss from you. One kiss, here on my cheek. That I'll pay with goodwill, said Dunstan, and with that he leaned across the stall amid the twinkling jingling of the crystal flowers, and he planted a chaste kiss on her soft cheek. He smelled the scent of her, then, intoxicating, magical. It filled the front of his head and his chest and his mind. There now, she said, and she passed him his snowdrop. He took it with hands that suddenly seemed to him to be huge and clumsy, and not at all small, in every way perfect like the hands of the fairy girl. And I'll see you back here tonight, Dunstan Thorn, when the moon goes down. Come here and hoot like a little owl. Can you do that? He nodded and stumbled away from her. He did not need to ask how she knew his surname. She had taken it from him along with certain other things, such as his heart. When he kissed her, the snowdrop chimed in his hand. "Why, Dunstan Thorne," said Daisy Hemstock, when he encountered her by Mr. Bromios's tent, sitting with her family and Dunstan's parents, eating great brown sausages and drinking porter. "Whatever is the matter?" "I brought you a gift," Dunstan muttered, and thrust the chiming snowdrop toward her. It glinted in the afternoon sunlight, and she took it from him, puzzled, with fingers still shiny with sausageries. Impulsively, Dunstan leaned forward, and in front of her mother and father and sister, in front of Bridget Comfrey and Mr. Bromios and all, he kissed her on her fair cheek. The outcry was predictable, but Mr. Hemstock, who had not lived on the border of Faery and the lands beyond for 57 years for nothing, exclaimed, "Hush now! Look at his eyes! Can't you see the poor boy's dazed in his wits, dazed and confused? He's bespelled, I'll wager you. Oi, Tommy Forrester, come here. Take young Dunstan Thorne back to the village and keep an eye on him. Let him sleep if he wishes, or talk if it's talk he needs." Tommy walked Dunstan out of the market and back to the village of Wall. "There now, Daisy," said her mother, stroking her hair. "He's just a little elf-touched, that's all. No need to take on so." And she pulled a lace handkerchief from her capricious bosom and dabbed at her daughter's cheek, which had suddenly become covered with tears. Daisy looked up at her and seized the handkerchief and blew her nose in it and sniffled into it, and Mrs. Hemstock observed with a certain perplexity that Daisy appeared to be smiling through the tears. "But, mother, Dunstan kissed me," said Daisy Hemstock, and she fixed the crystal snowdrop at the front of her bonnet, where it chimed and glistened. After some time spent searching for it, Mr. Hemstock and Dunstan's father found the stall where the crystal flowers were being sold, but the stall was being run by an elderly woman, accompanied by an exotic and very beautiful bird, which was chained to its perch by a thin silver chain. There was no reasoning with the old woman, for they tried to question her about what had happened to Dunstan, with all her talk was one of the prizes of her collection given away by a good-for-nothing, and that was what came of ingratitude, and of the sad modern times, and of today's servants. In the empty village, for who'd be in the village during the fairy market, Dunstan was taken into the 7th Magpie, given a wooden settle on which to sit. He rested his forehead on his hand and stared off into no one knows where,